In Lees-Galloway.
Mr Speaker, I rise to give my support for this bill and to note the bizarre contributions from the National Party members who now seem to be filibustering it. We have quite some interest in getting it moving along now, so all I would like to do is note my great support for this piece of legislation.
I call Nikki Kay.
I'm very pleased to speak on the Royal Society of New Zealand bill. Now, this is a very important piece of legislation to me on a number of levels. Firstly, I'm proud to be standing here as the Chair of Education and Science Select Committee, and I do want to acknowledge the former Chair of the Education and Science Select Committee, the late Alan Peachy, an incredible New Zealander who had a commitment not just to science but also to education, and I just want to acknowledge him this evening. The other person I want to acknowledge is the new Minister for Science and Innovation, the Honourable Stephen Joyce, and I think it is very significant, and it has been mentioned by members earlier in other speeches, that he not only has the portfolio for science and innovation but also tertiary education and skills. And the reason that is relevant, to this legislation is that if we want to show how much we value the Royal Society of New Zealand and the work of the Society, then we must approach it from a number of different angles. It cannot just be about one organisation. And I'm going to address some of those issues later on in my speech. But at the first outset, I want to touch on that issue of value, because on this side of the House we've been very clear that we value science not just through the way that we approach tertiary education, not just through the huge investment that we've been making in the area of science, but also we value it in this Parliament. And there has been mention this evening of what the passage of this bill has been. And I know that there are probably a number of people around New Zealand at the moment celebrating that tonight is the night that this piece of legislation goes through, because they have been waiting years for this legislation, Mr Speaker. These people who are associated with the Royal Society of New Zealand were subject to the filibustering of the Labour Party. We know, and we have heard in this House, that the Royal Society have been waiting a very long time for this piece of legislation. And it is so important because as a member of this House, one of the few members of this House that has a science degree, I have a Bachelor of Science in Genetics, but I also have a law degree. And what this bill is about is recognising not just the role that the Royal Society plays in terms of science, but also it is about recognising the importance of the humanities. And as someone who has both a Bachelor of Science in Genetics and a law degree, I consider myself adequately balanced in both the sciences and the humanities. And so it is a very important piece of legislation. But I do think we just want to make that point, that if you value science, then you probably shouldn't be holding up a bill that is so important, and there are so many people from the Royal Society that are respected, but they've had to wait years, and I know they will be sitting around New Zealand celebrating at this point in time as we hopefully pass this bill through the House. Anyway, just wanted to touch on some wider issues in terms of science investment. We've also shown our value and how much we value science by the Prime Minister's appointment of Sir Peter Gluckman. I've been very fortunate to have a little bit to do with him in the last couple of months, and he is, I believe, one of the most trusted New Zealanders. And I think that shows the value that people in New Zealanders are placing in terms of science. But also, I was fortunate to be able to attend the Prime Minister's Science Awards, whereby there was an outstanding young New Zealander, Bailey Lovett, who won, I think, the Prime Minister's Future Awards, and I want to acknowledge her this evening. But what it shows you is, and it comes back to the points that I made at the beginning of this bill, it can't just be about a piece of legislation through the House and one organisation. While they're doing great work, we must also invest in our young people. And I think that Prime Minister's Science Awards is an outstanding example of how we are investing in some of our young people. But also, it's about tertiary education reform. And obviously the Minister is doing a lot in that area, but we have also put significant money in, and I look forward to being involved in projects like the Wynyard Quarter Innovation Precinct, and projects like the Advanced High Tech Institute, and we've announced that that's a significant amount of money, but also that there will be centres both within Auckland and Canterbury, and I look forward to those discussions, Mr Speaker, about where that science infrastructure exists within New Zealand, because as I said before, you can have national organisations like the Royal Society of New Zealand, but you must also have good science infrastructure, not just the investment in people, whether it's through the Prime Minister's Science Awards, but it's also that investment in good science infrastructure. The other point that I'd like to make this evening is just to pay tribute to some of those outstanding New Zealanders that have come before us in this House, but also that have come and made a significant contribution. And I know, lots of people often mention Ernest Rutherford, but he did win the Nobel Prize, I believe, for chemistry in 1908. And he is one of those people, and it is important to look back, because when you have an organisation that has been around a significant period of time, like the Royal Society of New Zealand, to look back and occasionally reflect on those outstanding New Zealanders that have made a contribution, and they have not just made a contribution in New Zealand, which is going to lead me on to my next very important topic, but they've made not just a contribution in New Zealand, they've made a contribution internationally. And that's where I wanted to touch briefly, and it's a freaky coincidence, but we had GNS in front of our select committee today on the contribution that New Zealand makes to science internationally. And that is where I think the Royal Society of New Zealand have a very good reputation internationally. But GNS were front of our select committee today, and unfortunately, we are all aware in this House, members are very aware of the situation in Canterbury, but the huge amount of science that is going into some of the issues in terms of seismology in Canterbury. GNS in themselves, I think, have got an extra $3 million around natural hazards research. But there is a lot of things that are happening whereby the world, particularly with many more international disasters, whether they're tsunamis or earthquakes, there's some quite incredible areas whereby we need to be investing, and this government is investing, and we saw that through that extra $3 million that's gone into an organisation like GNS. But I think just to wrap up there, in terms of our science investment, it's this evening that this side of the House does value science. We value science both through how we invest money in infrastructure, and we announced a significant amount of that in the budget, also how we invest in our young people, how we value science through our tertiary education system, but also in our secondary schools, and also how we value and how we uphold those science leaders within our community, both those people who have come before us, like Sir Ernest Rutherford, and those people who exist today, like Sir Peter Gluckman, which leads me to some of the provisions within this bill. As members have already mentioned, that one of the key areas and the key amendments in this bill are around that recognition of the humanities. And one thing that frustrates me sometimes, Mr. Speaker, is that sometimes members think that certain sides of the House only care particular about maybe economic reform or science, but actually what's great about the amendments that are going through here, and what's great about the Royal Society's shift to recognise humanities, is it shows how well they are balanced, but it also, I think, is part of a wider global movement, which is understanding that sometimes the solutions to some of these problems are complex, and they involve looking at issues not just from a science perspective, but also understanding issues from a humanities perspective and some of the social consequences. So that's what these amendments were about in terms of the committee. I think it's also important to just take you through a little bit of the history in terms of this decision by the Royal Society to extend its academy to include researchers from the humanities. So there was a memorandum of understanding signed by the Society and Whānau Aranui, the Council for Humanities, in 2010. We also know that this approach is not just happening in New Zealand, it's also happening in other jurisdictions like Scotland and Canada. So I think that's very important because, as I said before, we know that this is a wider movement in terms of the way that we address domestic and global issues that we face both in New Zealand and throughout the world. So in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, it's been an absolute delight to speak on this bill because on this side of the House we value science, both in terms of our science infrastructure but also...
Sorry to interrupt the honourable member. Her time